Imagine standing in the middle of a burning village. The smoke is so thick you can barely breathe. Around you, the sound of children crying, warriors calling out, the distant crackle of everything your people have ever built turning to ash. The year is 1687. The largest army North America had ever seen has just marched through the heart of your homeland. And yet, somehow, your nation is not broken. Somehow, your warriors are still out there, still fighting, still breathing. How does a people survive that? How do they go from being nearly wiped off the map to controlling an empire that stretched from Canada down into the valleys of Pennsylvania? That is the story we are telling today. And trust me, by the end of it, you are going to see history in a way that no textbook ever showed you. Welcome to Frontier, Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin. Today we're diving into the full, unfiltered story of the Seneca Nation, the most powerful of the Six Nations, the keepers of the Western Door, one of the most fascinating peoples to ever walk this continent. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe because we do this every week. Now let's get into it. Long before any European ever set foot on this continent, the land west of present-day New York was alive with something rare in the ancient world, a functioning democracy, confederation of nations bound not by conquest but by law. The Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee or the Six Nations, was built on a document called the Great Law of Peace. Think about that for a moment. While European kings were butchering each other over crowns, these nations had already developed a governing constitution, a system of shared power, checks and balances, collective decision-making. Some historians believe it directly influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. And right at the center of that confederation, holding the western flank with an iron grip, stood the Seneca. They called themselves the Onondaga, not to be confused with the Onondaga Nation, because the word meant something different in their dialect, translated roughly to the Great Hill People, a name they believed traced back to their very origins, a treeless hill where their ancestors first emerged into the world. The name Seneca, the one that stuck, came from the Dutch. It meant, simply, the ones who live the farthest, the westernmost nation, the outermost gate, and they took that identity seriously. The Seneca were not just members of the Confederation. They were its military backbone. At the height of their power, the Seneca alone fielded more warriors than the other 5 nations combined. Let that sink in. More than half of the entire Iroquois military force came from one nation. They were the shield, they were the sword, and when the Confederation needed to expand its reach, it was the Seneca who led the charge. But before we talk about their power on the battlefield, let's understand what made them so strong at home. Seneca society was built on a foundation that most people in the modern world never expect when they think of ancient warrior cultures. It was built by women. The clan structure of the Seneca was matrilineal, meaning lineage, inheritance, and clan membership all passed through the mother's line. There were 8 clans, each named for an animal: the turtle, the snipe, the hawk, the bear, the heron, the beaver, the wolf, and the deer. And at the head of each clan sat a figure known as the clan mother. Now, here is where it gets interesting. The clan mother was not just a ceremonial title. She held real political power. She appointed chiefs. She could remove them. She managed the Longhouse, which was the physical and spiritual center of Seneca family life. She owned the land. She directed the planting and harvesting of the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, the agricultural triad that fed the entire nation. And in times of war, she held a power that no European queen of that era could claim. She could order the execution of a prisoner. She could adopt one into the family to replace a son lost in battle. She could launch a war party in the name of grief. That last point is crucial to understanding Seneca warfare. The concept was called the Morning War, when a Seneca warrior fell in battle, or when disease ripped through a village and took young men before their time. The loss was not just personal. This was not random conquest. This was deliberate systematic expansion driven by one primary motive: population recovery after the smallpox outbreak of 1635. Here is where that open loop pays off. When European traders and explorers first made contact with northeastern tribes in the early 1600s, they brought with them something far more lethal than muskets. They brought disease. Smallpox devastated indigenous populations across the continent, and the Seneca were no exception. Villages that had supported hundreds of people were reduced to handfuls of survivors. The morning war system, which had always existed on a smaller scale, suddenly went into overdrive. Confederacy needed people. And so the Seneca led a nearly 35-year campaign of conquest and absorption, capturing young women and children, integrating them into clans, building the population back up through forced adoption. By 1675, the Seneca and their confederacy dominated a corridor of land stretching from Canada in the north to Ohio in the south, from the Mohawk Valley in the east to what would later become Pittsburgh in the west. No European power on the continent could ignore them. The French could not get through them. The English needed them. The Dutch traded with them. And the Seneca knew exactly how valuable that position was. Their warriors traveled established trade and diplomatic routes, some of which they had named and maintained for generations. They made diplomatic visits to New Amsterdam, what we now call Manhattan, in 1657 and 1658. They mediated conflicts between European settlers and neighboring tribes. They played the colonial powers against each other with a skill and sophistication that would have impressed any Renaissance diplomat. But that sophistication could only hold for so long, because in 1685, a man arrived in New France with very specific orders. His name was the Marquis de Denonville. And King Louis XIV had sent him to do one thing: trace the Seneca from the map. In 1687, Denonville led the largest military expedition that North America had seen at that point. He crossed into Seneca territory, moved quickly, burned the eastern capital, a town called Ganondagan. Villages were razed. Food stores were destroyed. Hundreds of Seneca people fled westward, southward. Scattering into the forests and valleys they knew better than any European soldier ever could. And here is the part that Denonville never fully understood. He thought he had broken them. He had not. The Seneca military force was largely intact. The warriors who mattered most, the ones who would determine the next decade of conflict, were still out there, and they were furious. Do you think a nation that had survived smallpox, that had built an empire through loss and adaptation, was going to surrender because one French general burned some longhouses? Think about what that says about the Seneca identity. Think about what kind of people forge that kind of resilience. Let me know in the comments, because I want to know what you think about this. Everything you have built gets torn down. What does it take to rebuild? Because the Seneca answer to that question is one of the most remarkable things in this entire story. The aftermath of Denonville's raid, the Seneca redoubled their alliance with the British in the Eastern Territories. They remained a critical strategic partner throughout the colonial period, their military muscle and their territorial knowledge making them indispensable to whoever they chose to support. And for most of the colonial era, that meant the English. The alliance was formalized in 1677 through something called the Covenant Chain, a diplomatic framework linking the Iroquois Confederacy with English colonial authorities. It was renewed and strengthened in 1768 through the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which also established boundaries meant to prevent American colonial expansion into Iroquois territory. The Americans immediately began pushing past those boundaries. That was the beginning of the end of the Senecas' uneasy peace with their new neighbors to the south. When the American Revolution arrived, it did not come as a clear conflict with obvious sides. For the Seneca, it arrived as an impossible choice, and for the Iroquois Confederacy, it arrived as a death sentence. The Albany Council, in the summer of 1775, gathered the nations to debate. Should they fight, and if so, for whom? The Confederacy had survived for centuries by navigating exactly these kinds of crises. But this time, the pressures were different. The Americans were not another colonial power to be played against a rival. They were something new. They were settlers who believed, deeply and vocally, that the land was theirs by right of civilization, that the people who had lived on it for thousands of years were, in the words of their own Declaration of Independence, merciless Indian savages. That phrase landed like a war club. For many Seneca warriors, it settled the question. The Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca aligned with the British. The Oneida and the Tuscarora, swayed in part by the American missionary Samuel Kirkland, sided with the Americans. For the first time in the Confederacy's history, the council fire was extinguished. The Six Nations were at war with each other. What followed was some of the darkest and most complicated fighting in the entire Revolutionary period. In 1677, August 6th, Iroquois forces ambushed Patriot soldiers at Oriskany in one of the bloodiest single engagements of the war. The scene was grim. The Patriot forces were caught in a ravine. Most of them did not come out whole. It was a tactical triumph for the British-aligned Iroquois, and it was also the moment when the nature of this war changed entirely. Because after Oriskany, the Americans stopped thinking about the Iroquois as potential allies to be negotiated with. They started thinking about them as a problem to be solved permanently. The Seneca, along with their Cayuga, Onondaga, and Mohawk allies, continued to conduct raids into American settlements throughout 1777 and 1778. The Cherry Valley Raid, the Wyoming Valley Campaign. These were carefully organized, militarily effective operations. They were also devastating to civilian populations. And, among the Seneca, there were warriors who felt the weight of that. Governor Blacksnake, one of the most prominent Seneca leaders of the era, later reflected on the actions at Oriskany and said that he believed them to be greatly sinful in the sight of God. That is not the voice of a man who enjoyed what war had become. That is the voice of someone who understood exactly what the revolution was doing to his people's soul. The American response left no room for moral nuance. In 1779, General George Washington authorized what became known as the Sullivan Expedition. The mission was clear. Do not merely overrun the Iroquois settlements, destroy them entirely. The soldiers who marched into Seneca and Iroquois territory that year followed orders with grim efficiency. They did not just burn longhouses. They destroyed every food store they could find, every field of corn and beans and squash, every root cellar, every supply that would be needed to survive the coming winter. A Seneca woman named Mary Jemison, who had been adopted into the nation years earlier and had fully embraced Seneca life, later described what the soldiers had done. They had destroyed every article of the food kind that they could lay their hands on. And then the winter of 1780 came, one of the harshest winters on record, and the Iroquois who had not fled to British-held territory starved. The Sullivan expedition did not end Seneca resistance. What it did was make that resistance entirely personal. The raids that followed in 1780 and 1781 were not tactical operations. They were grief-given military form. Seneca and Cayuga warriors who returned to find their villages ash and their families dead did not go home and accept defeat. They hit back, hard, against American settlements in New York, against their former Confederacy brothers, the Oneida and Tuscarora, who had taken the other side. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. Seneca did not stop fighting. When the British general Frederick Haldimand recalled his indigenous allies to await the peace negotiations in Paris, the Seneca finally put down their weapons, not because they had lost, not because they had surrendered, but because their most powerful ally had walked away from the table, and there was nothing left to fight for in the same way. Treaty of Paris in 1783 changed the world for the Seneca. The British ceded their territorial claims to the new United States. The Seneca, who had fought for the British, were not mentioned in that treaty at all. Their lands, their sacrifices, their 3 centuries of strategic alliance, none of it had earned them so much as a single line in the agreement that decided their fate. Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784 forced the Seneca and other Confederacy nations to relinquish their lands in New York State. The legal and diplomatic erosion continued from there. 1788, Seneca leaders sold the land east of the Genesee River to Massachusetts land speculators. In 1797, at the Treaty of Big Tree, they sold the lands west of the Genesee River, reserving 10 small reservations for their own use. And then came January 15, 1838, the Treaty of Buffalo Creek. The United States government, working with a faction of compliant Seneca leaders, negotiated an agreement that would have relocated the entire Seneca nation to Kansas Territory west of Missouri. The overwhelming majority of Seneca people rejected it completely. They refused to comply. They organized. They pushed back through every legal and political channel they could find. That resistance mattered. By 1848, the Seneca in New York had established a modern elected government, the Seneca Nation of Indians, with a written constitution and formal representation. Tonawanda Band of Seneca, who had their own deep objections to the forced sales and relocations, chose to maintain a more traditional form of tribal governance. Both groups received federal recognition. Both groups survive to this day. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. A nation that was targeted for erasure by the largest military the continent had seen. A nation whose confederacy was deliberately shattered by the forces of revolution. A nation that watched its language, its land, and its population shrink under 2 centuries of pressure. They are still here. Today, around 10,000 Seneca people live near Lake Erie. Approximately 7,800 of them are citizens of the Seneca Nation of Indians, living and working on 5 reservations in New York State, including the Allegheny Reservation, which encompasses the city of Salamanca, the Cattaraugus Reservation near Gowanda, the Buffalo Creek Territory in downtown Buffalo, and smaller territories near Niagara Falls and Cuba, New York. Estimated 10,000 to 25,000 Seneca individuals who migrated to Canada during and after the Revolution live in the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario, one of the largest Iroquois reserves in the world, and the language. In 2007, Seneca was classified as critically endangered, with fewer than 50 fluent speakers, most of them elderly. But efforts to revitalize it have been ongoing. Language camps, school programs, recording projects. Because language is not just communication. For the Seneca, it carries within it their view of the world, their relationship to the land, their history spoken aloud across generations. Losing it would be losing something that cannot be rebuilt the same way a village or a government can. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I think about this a lot. The Seneca built an empire without any of the tools we associate with empire building. No standing professional army in the European sense, no centralized bureaucracy, no currency economy. What they had was a social structure so deeply rooted, so intelligently designed, that it could absorb almost any shock. Smallpox, military defeat, the collapse of the Confederacy, forced relocation, legal dispossession. At every turn, something in the Seneca way of life, whether it was the clan system, the matrilineal networks, the adopted family bonds, or the political savvy their leaders had developed over centuries, gave them a way through. Were they perfect? No. The morning wars were brutal. Their raids on settlements during the Revolution caused immense suffering. Their history, like all history, contains chapters that are hard to read without flinching. The arc of what they built and what they refused to let go is one of the most compelling stories in American history. They were the keepers of the Western door. When everything tried to push that door shut forever, they braced it open with whatever they had left. Do you think there are lessons in that kind of institutional resilience that matter today? Genuinely want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hit differently than you expected, share it with someone who needs to hear it. That is how we keep these narratives alive. I'm Dustin. This is Frontier Uncensored. We will see you.